John William Cooper was born in Milford Haven, Wales. He was one of 7 children. His father worked as an agricultural labourer, and soon John Cooper himself would work the fields as a local farmhand.
He was part of the post-war baby boom generation. He left school at 15, he got involved in a range of different trades, which wasn't anything particularly unusual. So he appeared to have a fairly regular upbringing. There aren't any really obvious signs of the trauma, the abuse, or the neglect that we see in cases of serial killers.
He left home at 15. One of the reasons why he was able to leave is because he was a fairly talented guy around the farm, in a rural environment. He could do a lot of things, so he could get by. And he was a very independent person. Most children wouldn't leave then because they'd be afraid to. He wasn't afraid because he was a man, he could take care of himself.
He was quite well known in the local farming community, you know, making his way in the world.
Soon, the wayward Cooper settled down to family life. He married his childhood sweetheart at the age of 21, and before long they welcomed a son and a daughter into the world.
From the outside, Cooper did appear to be a regular family guy. They had 2 children, so looking in, they looked to be the ideal nuclear family. Cooper presented quite a respectable veneer to the outside world.
But the married man Cooper liked to indulge outside of the family home.
He did quite enjoy the high life. He liked going out and drinking and gambling, and he was gregarious. The people that knew him socially thought he was a stand-up guy, but actually he had a very short fuse. He would lose his temper very easily. So here's somebody who's crafting this performance of self, which isn't the real him.
He was quite well known in the local community, quite well liked, known to have a violent temper, but nevertheless, you know, one of the boys, so to speak, in the local pub.
In 1978, at the age of 34, Cooper found work with the multi-million-dollar oil giant Gulf, working as a welder's mate at the local refinery. That same year, Cooper himself struck it rich, winning a newspaper competition, Spot the Ball.
He won £90,000, a fortune. In today's terms, it would probably £500,000, as well as a £4,000 Austin princess. If he had been a more temperate man, he would probably have saved some of that money.
But after giving £1,000 each to 10 of his family members, the generosity seemed to stop there. Cooper, the gambler, started burning a hole through his lucky winnings.
This is a life-changing amount of money. But he didn't hold on to it for very long. I think because he did live that fast and high lifestyle, he continued to gamble, he continued to drink, he invested in fairly misplaced business ventures. So he was soon parted from that money. But once that money was gone, it didn't get rid of that sense of entitlement, that sense in which I want to have these things that I was able to buy before.
There's a hypomanic quality to it. He looks to me like he probably was what some people call a cyclothymic personality or manic depressive illness. And in his moments of euphoria, he gambles, he thinks he can do anything, and all of a sudden he looks down and his money's gone.
The seemingly happy-go-lucky John Cooper was in fact deeply troubled beneath the surface. His teenage son particularly bore the brunt of Cooper's rage. Not only was he subjected to beatings, at one stage he even claimed his father placed a shotgun into his mouth and threatened to kill him.
He contrived to be a violent and aggressive man. It drove the son out of the house. He couldn't bear his father.
Despite his son escaping the home at just 16, Cooper had to keep up the appearance of a happy family, enjoying their newfound wealth that he'd secretly squandered. With no sign of getting caught during his 2-year crime spree around rural Pembrokeshire, Cooper thought he was on a winning streak. On the night of the 22nd of December 1985, he racked the stakes up even higher. His next target was barely a mile from his own doorstep, Scoverston Manor in Stainton.
Now, they are local farmers, they're quite wealthy, and Cooper is known to them, so this is quite a close-knit community.
They're a rich and reclusive pair called Richard and Helen Thomas. They lived in a 3-storey farmhouse set in considerable acres, not more than a mile from where Cooper actually lived. Cooper got there thinking that Helen would be on her own, burst in, threatened her with the shotgun.
But unbeknownst to Cooper, Helen's brother Richard was close by.
Unexpectedly, Richard returned, almost without thinking. Cooper turns his shotgun on Richard and kills him. He ties up Helen and shoots her in the face, killing her.
The siblings were both shot at close range in the head, but brother Richard was also wounded in the stomach.
A close-range discharge with a shotgun will almost completely destroy the head. If Richard was shot in the stomach first, he'd be well aware of what had happened to him. For Richard, we can only hope that the shot to the head was first and that he was dead from that. I strongly suspect that the first shot was the one to the abdomen. When it didn't kill him, then there's the fatal shot to the head. The whole situation must have been utterly terrifying.
It was a dastardly, brutal crime in pursuit, of course, of Cooper's lifestyle. But he then sets fire to the house in an effort to conceal the crime.
So not only has he invaded their privacy and their space, not only has he taken their things, not only has he taken their lives, he's decided that he's going to burn the place to the ground. Cooper committed these crimes in his own backyard, and I think this high-risk offending, he didn't really care, I think, or didn't really think very much far ahead. He would see an opportunity and he would take it. He would live very much in the present moment, not really giving very much thought to what was going to happen afterwards.
Police had heard about Cooper's fondness for the limelight, and in February 2009, a copy of the episode that he appeared on was traced back to ITV's archive in Leeds. They compared it to a sketch of a suspect seen using Peter Dixon's bank card, wearing similar shorts to the ones found in Cooper's home.
When they looked at the video and then compared that video to the artist's impression of the man who might have attacked the Dixons, the two were almost identical. I think the superintendent said it was as if you could trace one over the other. It was almost a perfect match. So now we begin to have the net closing around Cooper.
Now Cooper was back out on the streets, having served 10 years of his 16-year sentence for armed robbery and burglary. But time was running out for the killer.
More and more details being heaped on top of what the police are coming to believe is an absolutely airtight case against Cooper. In May, barely months after he's got out of jail, Cooper is rearrested.
The police even filmed the moment they pounced on Cooper as he went to collect his morning paper, satisfied they'd put this dangerous killer back in prison.
He continues to deny everything. But the forensic evidence is beginning to become overwhelming.
During questioning, Cooper admitted owning the shorts that had the key evidence against him, Peter Dixon's blood. Further forensic tests on the clothing had thrown up something even more interesting.
The hem had actually been taken up, so they took the hem down and they found another piece of DNA evidence. Now, this DNA belonged to the daughter of Peter and Gwenda Dixon, so this proved fairly conclusively that these shorts belonged to Peter Dixon.
Police believe these were stolen from Peter's rucksack just before Cooper fled the murder scene. Cooper was finally brought to Swansea Crown Court on the 22nd of March 2011 to face justice. As well as the expert witnesses lined up to prove the case against him, his own son also took to the stand, unmasking the dark, violent side of the lovable rogue. He revealed his habitual nighttime walks, stalking the local Pembrokeshire countryside, armed and dangerous.
He denied everything. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And for weeks sustained precisely that stance. But that did not convince the jury. The forensic evidence proved decisive, as did the bullseye videotape.
When Cooper returned for sentencing on the 26th of May, he continued to protest his innocence.
You must judge me after the trial, not before.
Judge John Griffith Williams gave him 4 life sentences and told him the murders were of such evil wickedness that the mandatory sentence of life will mean just that. For Angela Gallup and her team, it had been a triumph for their painstaking forensics work.
It was a really satisfying case. I think he's an extremely dangerous man. I think he's just one of the most dangerous criminals that I've come across in my time in doing forensic science.
Well, the Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield.
It's not the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, but it's plenty big enough for those of us that live here.
Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small, never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. You know, probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building.
The Gein's 150-acre farm was located on the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue. Ed rarely got to leave the property and socialize with other children.
His mother, Augusta, is a very domineering character indeed. She is a devout Christian and she has some very extreme ideas about sin and about morality. And she drums into her sons that they're not to socialise with anybody outside of the family because all of the people around them in the local town are sinners, they're evil, all the women are whores. And so she creates this very insular family environment where they're quite isolated from the rest of the community, and that has a really significant impact on them.
Gein seemed to have been very friendless whenever he would make some kind of friend. On those rare occasions, when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation.
And Gein's relationship with his father was also far from perfect.
Well, the father, George, was an alcoholic. He appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment, but mostly the picture that emerges of George is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all 3 male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household.
As Ed entered adolescence, his life became even more insular.
He dropped out of school when he was around about 12 or 13 to work on the family's farm. And he was considered to be a bit of an oddball. He was quite a loner and he enjoyed quite solitary pursuits. So he really quite liked reading and was quite a prolific reader. So he was somebody who didn't really fit in, but worked incredibly hard to keep the family farm going.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Wharton.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Wharton. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. Yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Wharton in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, now it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. Somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.
As the search of the farmhouse progressed, officers found that the grotesque collection of body parts became even more disturbing.
Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother.
Gein's macabre collection had been acquired from the very same cemetery where his mother's body lay.
2 years after the death of his mother in 1947, he starts grave robbing. So he's going into a local burial ground, he's digging up bodies, and he's taking things from the bodies. Now, he's not taking jewellery or items of any value, he's actually taking body parts. It really is an absolute house of horrors. So what started off as an interest, which was confined to the pages of a book, has now become a reality behind the doors of this rather bizarre house. So what he's doing in a really grotesque way is trying to bring his mother back to life in some way, shape or form, because he was just so dependent upon her for a sense of his own identity.
And the search wasn't over yet. Officers would soon discover, inside a paper bag in Gein's home, the severed head of a woman who'd been missing from Plainfield for over 2 years. It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Kluke and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Kluke was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Kluke.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he's doing bits and pieces. People don't understand, you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin was no fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelika Kluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelika was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say, that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelika Kluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams.
There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelika Kluk, working on some woodwork.
He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelika intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelika Kluk under the floorboards of St Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelika's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelika's body was awful enough, that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelika's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them, and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelika's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he'd checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.